Creation of value is a good thing, but some of the things we do on the back end of that service have value. Support is valuable because it maintains the service. Security is valuable because it protects the service. It's not a separate thing to it. So if I start with value, all the elements that we do in a business, including what IT does, speaks to how it affects the value of the services that we provide. And it allows you to link everybody's work together.
Where would we be without digital services? Today, our smartphones and screens are our window into the economy. If they get fogged up, we're lost. But many of the organizations that serve us don't prioritize the end-to-end service experience. They focus instead on smaller scale internal services, leaving a ton of value on the table and frustrating their customers. There is hope. Designing with enterprise services in mind might not be easy, but your consumers will thank you. Joining me here today to talk about how we define digital and enterprise services is research fellow Valence Houghton. Valence, thanks so much for joining today.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
So let's maybe start at the beginning. How do we define digital and enterprise services, IT or otherwise?
I think that the starting point is understanding it from the perspective of who consumes services. There's always been a challenge with people in terms of understanding what a service is versus other things an organization produces. What are the products which have a carryover, relationship to it? What are the capabilities of my organization, which is different than the services I provide? But bringing it down to something that's consumed that has direct value, but people do not necessarily own the direct cost of doing so, the elements of it. I always liken it to, I go get my hair done, that's a service. It contains a lot of things. For me, not so much, but there's the shaver aspect of it. Yeah. There's the electricity, the location, the type of store. All those things are part of the service element for me. But the service is, getting my hair done. And if you translate that back into what are the services IT provides, it's in that same type of context. There's a lot of work we do that's part of it, but the service at a digital or enterprise version still has those components too.
So let's talk about that digital or enterprise version, because we've got research, we've got content on IT service management, on IT services, broadly. What is a digital or enterprise service and what makes it different?
I think the big shift is, up until now, we really spent a lot of time on IT services as a component of something we provide to the organization that they use to provide products and services for their consumers. When you start looking at services at a digital or enterprise level, you start moving the service management or the service component to, here's what my organization provides through technology. The digital services, the enterprise services that are consumed by external parties, by our organization.
What would you tell a CIO or a senior enterprise leader about why this should be on their radar?
I think that's always been the hard conversation, which is this is not a new concept in terms of we have to focus on what it is we provide to consumers, however we define that in our organization. The big shift is we should be focusing on the value people get from the things we provide.
Right.
If I can understand value, I understand the value of the products and services I generate. So if I'm going to be service focused, I'm value focused. It's easy to understand I produce this and it does that, A right. and B. Turning it to what does somebody need from it? What experience do they get from it? That's where service really comes in.
Right. So it's not necessarily that it's net new. It's just almost an inversion of some of the common practices we're seeing out there.
Yeah, it's an inversion of perspective where we start to look at it.
Right.
Drives how we look at service that we provide.
Right. So what is the state of the nation out there when it comes to, services, or what most organizations you speak with are doing now?
Well, you get a hybrid of, or a product organization or a service organization. I mean, realistically, everyone's just producing something of value. Mm-hmm. I think it varies by your industry in a lot of cases. And there's also a combination of factors. Governments provide services. At the end of the day, whether you have a product model for delivery,
right.
From a constituent perspective, I go to a DMV or whatever, yeah. I can get a license. That's a service I'm consuming from you. And that gets paid for. Now, whether I call it a product or service, it's still the same thing. And in a lot of cases, they're sort of bonded. We at Infotech have products and services that are interlinked. I have a workshop product that's consumed and delivered as a service. Mm. So they don't have to develop it themselves. We have that product, but in its delivery, it's a service we provide to organizations. So people have to understand sort of there can be a distinction. but it's really in the perspective of who's consuming it.
Right. So let's come back to that kind of consumer focus, because I want to jump into some of the key insights here. And the first key insight you have, Valence, is that when we think about services, we need to think about them as being business value oriented, or at least that they can be. Can you maybe walk me through what that means?
I think it's getting everyone to really look at services. Like I said, it's not just the lens of the consumer, but value as from a business perspective.
Right.
Digital services, enterprise services, these are all things that generate some form of value for the organization. So shifting that lens allows me to understand the value it provides. So when we say it's for the business, everything IT does is for the business. We just don't really talk about it from a lens of these services have these types of value.
Right.
So if we can shift that lens at the digital and the enterprise level, okay, this is the value that people get from it. Here's how we're involved with it, whether it's through generation of it or other aspects, but that view changes how we actually execute and deliver. It also allows people to understand value from more than one dimension. Creation of value is a good thing, but some of the things we do on the back end of that service have value. Support is valuable because it maintains the service. Security is valuable because it protects the service. It's not a separate thing to it. So if I start with value, all the elements that we do in a business, including what IT does, speaks to how it affects the value of the services that we provide. And it allows you to link everybody's work together.
Right. So I'm going to ask you what may be too big a question, but how do you do that? How do you define that value if you're taking this outside-in approach?
There are a lot of different ways that people use for that. Some parts are stakeholder engagement. I need to know, and maybe building a value profile for them or
Sure.
some type of a customer profile, but who uses my services and why, or who would use this and what are they trying to do with it? So starting to break down the different types of consumer you have, what they do with it, that's going to give me some insight into, what the value is for them. Having active conversations with people who use the services we have. Is this useful to you? Why? What are you trying to do? How much can I pull it from those consumers of that understanding that's going to allow me to actually do something like a value stream map and understand here's the things we do to generate value in this service that we provide. And here's where we have challenges that we can improve. But it really starts from the eyes of who's using this and why.
Right.
So as much as we can get that information from people, and I think in the set we talk a little bit about building those customer profiles and understanding who would use your services and why, or understanding who your stakeholders are and what their needs are. That's really the driver of, is this the right service for them? And sort of how we put the right boundaries around it.
Right. And all of this is done, through the lens of, an IT leader or an IT audience. What makes IT uniquely suited for this type of activity?
I think it's a combination, because I think sometimes we get hung up on what makes IT uniquely suited, what makes the business suited for
Sure.
whatever. When we get into digital and enterprise services, it's how does my organization understand them? So IT has a good understanding of the technology and the elements that make a digital service work.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where we add unique value and perspective to the enterprise conversation. And I think in a lot of cases, we're the ones who understand the use cases enough to drive some of that use.
Right.
But the other thing is the business has to get it. And that's weird isolation where the business needs to understand that IT gets it. IT is still the business.
Mm.
This weird thing where we think we're not part of the same
Right.
sphere. We're all part of the organization. We bring this capability and this knowledge to bear to help the organization better navigate the technologies, but the business navigates the rationale, why they need it, how it's structured to generate these services.
Right. So we have a role to play in this, but we also don't want to overplay our hand or, mistake this exercise for, we're the only game in town and, try and take it all the way to the finish line without collaborating with business units.
Well, realistically, we don't necessarily own the accountability and authority for the service value proposition.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that we're going to drag it there without the authority to drag it there,
Right.
and that the person who's accountable for its value is just going to let us do it,
Yeah.
I'm going to say naive, it's just misplaced.
Right.
Which is, if I'm going to take the brunt of the good and the bad, you can bank on the fact that I'm going to have a say in what we generate.
Right. So, does it make sense to think of this almost as like a cross-functional team that you need to have working together to get this done?
It always has been.
Yeah.
It's not like we talked about, we're going to build a service, we're going to do this as an organization. And now we're going to talk to finance
Yeah.
about money. No, we have to understand the finance to build.
Right.
We have to understand the human relations aspect of it, the
Yeah.
HR pieces of what's allowable and what's not. We have to understand the laws that apply to us. All these things are part of defining what we do.
Right.
So that carries over into the services that we provide.
Yeah.
We need all these views to do it effectively.
Right. And so, to talk about the implications there for how this kind of gets kicked off, is this an initiative that IT can kind of lead the kickoff of, or is this more like is this so critical that like the business kind of has to like invite IT to the ball, so to speak? Like, does the kickoff have to start there, or can we take the lead?
We can take the lead. And a lot of it's going to depend on how IT is positioned in the organization and the perspective they have of IT's role.
Right.
If we're seen as a part of the organization, either fully or as a partner of the organization, it's very easy for us to sort of drive this conversation. Here are things that we do that we can optimize through technology. Here's new services that we can, build out. So IT can take a leading role in that, in the understanding that they're doing it as part of the organizational view. So we're acting as an agent of the business now. In places where we're a cost center, we're order takers, whatever we want to call that, it's much harder to be part of that strategic conversation. So it's harder to lead this type of initiative in isolation. So we're going to need partners, we're going to need help, we're going to need others to help us there. We have to understand the cultural and organizational viability of this.
To what degree does culture play a role here, and how does it shape, or mold what this is ultimately going to look like?
People often underestimate the implications of constraint, culture being a major one of those. It spins up, I think I've mentioned in other conversations, it's an emergent trait of an organization. It spins up and becomes what it is. If I want to change a culture, I have to change the environment. So the culture will change the interactions that we have. The interactions will drive the change in the behaviors that drive the culture.
Right.
But if I don't even understand what those are, that's difficult. But the back end is I have to create an environment that allows us to move to service thinking.
Sure.
I'm going to focus on that. I'm going to build roles that have authority. I'm going to change how I measure things. I'm going to make success unified. I'm going to do a whole bunch of things that make it easy for us to move into that mindset. I'm going to make sure people understand the terminology so they're not confusing one thing for another.
So, if we think about the goal being to get to, if I can call it a service-minded organization, is there one cultural archetype that enables that? Is there multiple? Like, what does this look like in practice, given different kind of cultural archetypes or types of organizations that you've seen?
I've seen it executed in multiple structures and operating models of organizations. So I'm not sure there's one particular archetype that works. There are ones that are better suited to it, absolutely. But even there, you have variations based on whether it's all in-house, whether it's very vendor organized, which is I can have vendors aggregate and build a lot of what I provide as a service. And that operates in a very different way than if it's all in-house or if it's all cloud-based. And the other end is really, I would say I've done it with organizations that are more agile or adaptive in nature. That's perfectly fine. I've done it with very traditional organizations as well. So I don't know that one model works better than the other. The orientation is what matters at the leadership level.
Right.
So how do I change all the things that are going to change the behaviors that allow this to happen? I think the challenge sometimes in any model when you shift is you have to change the mindset. You have to understand the attitudes. You have to understand the behaviors, and then intentionally do things that are going to make that easier in a service-oriented organization.
Can you paint me a picture of like, what does good look like? Is there one, kind of singular, objective here, or like, what are the common traits in organizations that are doing this properly?
One is the ability to actually measure and understand understand who they're providing service for in a meaningful way. Mm-hmm. If I understand who I'm providing services to, what their needs are, I have some mechanism of feedback that's consistent, and I'm focused not on the individual activities of work, although that is important, but are we getting value? Is the utilization there? Is people who have a good understanding of those things and actively seek that information out are very well positioned. In a lot of cases, organizations, right intention is not designed to execute it. So it's something we don't always go into, but the operating model or organizational structure has to shift to enable this in a lot of cases. We're not designed to be a service organization.
Right.
So what do we have to change in the capabilities we have to have and the way we're built in order to do this more effectively? And can we map out value streams of how we deliver to understand that as well.
Joining me here on our panel today to discuss all things digital and enterprise services, we've got research fellow Valence Howden, we've got AVP of Research Colleen McCubbin, and we've got practice lead Tony Denford. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks, Jeff.
Nice to see you.
So I want to jump right into the challenges here, I guess. Valence and I have been talking, and everything here just, frankly, seems to make a lot of sense. We want to think about value. We want to be taking an end-to-end approach with services. What are the challenges? Why isn't everybody just doing this? What's preventing this from being successful?
I think for a lot of us, it feels like it makes sense, right? Because we've been talking about the evolution of IT and the changing role of IT for a long time. But this requires an actual fundamental change in the role of the IT organization. You are no longer just providing services to the organization, you are the service, right? And so it's a true collaboration between the technology leaders within the organization, the end customers who oftentimes the technology development teams haven't had direct access to, right? It requires collaborating at every level of the organization. And that's a fundamental shift from how people have traditionally viewed the IT department, how it's executed. On top of that siloed barrier, we have this other massive challenge in that the lines of business or the departments within the organization are also heavily siloed. So now not only do we have to get IT to step out of their comfort zone, but we have to get each line of business to think holistically across, not just in terms of what they're trying to achieve and what their customer wants, but we have to think layer by layer all the way through to how are they going to use this across the full enterprise.
There's a difference between saying I want to do it and actually wanting to do it. And a lot of people, I'm going to say it because it makes sense. It sounds good.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to commit my resources to it. I'm not going to line these things up for you. I'm not going to behave and align with the work we want to do. And I've been saying a lot on the governance side, a lot of things change because it's not beneficial to certain people for it to change. We always assume that everyone wants it to move. Some people, it's beneficial if it doesn't move. So we also understand some of the constraints in the organization are who benefits most from this not moving? Because that's going to have a big impact on the success of almost any initiative, but a shifting mindset at this scale, as was mentioned, requires everyone to be on the same page and see the benefit of doing it. And that's not always going to be the case. And in a lot of organizations, that is not the case.
Sometimes it's not conscious either, right?
Correct.
They're not resisting moving here. It's just they've got their day job to do. They've always been a service provider to the rest of the business. So therefore, I'm going to keep doing that because that's where we're comfortable. And then suddenly, the world has changed.
Yeah.
Right. And your audience now is digitally native. Right, your customers, your consumers of your services are used to and expect to have that option. So,
and I'll add the other end of it is the business also doesn't see IT in that role.
Right.
It doesn't perceive the role of IT to be that. So you're going to spin up a CDO, an innovation officer, and I'm going to do that piece myself. So it doesn't necessarily see IT in that role, and it starts to build other mechanisms to do it in the organization.
Right.
So it's that whole shift of I need something new to do this, I need something new to do that, which re-silos the organization as well when these things need to be integrated. So the advent of new things is usually a poor approach in terms of dealing with it, but everyone recommends it. Create a committee for that, build this thing for this. Well, how many of them can you have before they work at cross purposes and move you away from the behaviors and expectations you should have and move you from that mindset? They're in conflict with each other.
Right. I'm curious, I know there's a whole kind of readiness assessment component of what we're describing, but more anecdotally, I'd love to hear stories about organizations you've spoken with, leaders you've spoken with, where you've thought like, there's something about what you're saying that just tells me like, you are not ready for this, or you are ready for this. Like, what are some of the portraits you've come across?
The most specific one was, well, I'm not doing this. That was okay.
Well, that's pretty.
We talked it
conclusive.
through. Everyone else agreed. This guy said, I'm not doing it. I don't think that's right. Okay, you're not moving. So it sometimes can be as explicit as that. I don't want to do this. I'm not going to do this. And thanks for your time.
Yeah. Immovable object syndrome.
The other one is the other end of it, which is we're going to follow this framework and do it exactly.
I think even if they think they're not ready for it, they probably should be.
Yeah.
you're just going to become less competitive. If you're a taxi company and Uber comes into town, what choice do you have? You're going to have to start digitizing something because that's what the marketplace has moved to.
Right.
So, you can choose not to do it. You can choose not to think in these terms, but you may not feel like you're ready. But if you're not, you're going to fall by the wayside and you're going to disappear.
And waiting till you're ready is not always the best play. People are rarely ready.
Right. You just have to have the courage
Sometimes
to do
you have to move. And readiness is not a sign, because most people are never fully ready because you don't understand all the conditions to be ready for. At some point, I'm ready enough is as good as you're going to get.
As ready as I can be, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it reminds me of the old joke about who drove your digital transformation? Was it your CIO, your CEO, or COVID, right? To what degree are we seeing organizations, being proactive here versus being, forced into a corner reactively by, the Ubers of the world or the market conditions? And how does that impact how you tackle this?
I think we're seeing a mix, right? Some people, it's happened to them already, and they're trying to figure out how to catch up or not fall too far behind. And then you've got the others who are going, well, it's happened in all these industries. Maybe we should start thinking about it now. I would say that if you're a CIO today and you're not thinking about AI and you're not thinking about digital services, you probably shouldn't be a CIO today.
Right. Your successor will be, right?
Your successor will be. And, the life of a CIO is pretty short. So, you should go in with some ideas around how to improve things and how to bring value to the organization, not wait for the organization to ask you to create value.
Carlene, you mentioned dynamic service design. What is that, and how does that come into the mix?
Yeah, so dynamic service design is definitely a trend that we have been seeing increase, strongly enabled by AI, right? And that is where, when I'm interacting with an organization, what is presented to me changes dynamically based on my data. So maybe the web presence is different. Maybe the login pieces are different. Maybe the types of services that are displayed to me on that page are different based on my personal preferences, based on demographic information that I've shared. This makes it a lot easier for me to consume those services. I can also see things from, energy organizations oftentimes will have similar things where they'll show you your consumption, they'll show you ways of reducing, they'll show you ways how your billing cycles are going, things like that, so you can plan, and it changes what's available to you. Another great example is health insurance. So your health insurance provider, you'll notice they may actually provide you different information when you log in based on some of your preferences. So lately, I've been seeing a lot more things on there about have you considered exercise? Have you considered?
How polite of them.
Right? It's very because they're going into more health promotion, right? And so based on data that they have, they're able to kind of tailor that experience so that, one, they can upsell, two, they can save costs, and three, they can get the person what they need most from the organization.
Right.
I have a real life example of this. I used to work for the organization that does Ontario's land registry. And so we used to call these channels. These are the channels that the customers come in, or the consumers of the services come in with. So they originally had an over-the-counter service. So you would have to go into an Ontario land registry office, and you would have to walk up to a counter and you would tell them what piece of property you're interested in. They would go pull the records out of a file and give it to you and give you a photocopy of it or whatever they gave you. We then started doing a digital version of that, but it was still in the same physical office. So you could walk into the office, walk up to a terminal, and you could access the data. And then, of course, it's all gone online now. So now you can do it online, and you can see the information from the luxury of home. Now, the cost to deliver the online one versus the in-office one is significantly different. You're not paying staff, right? You're not having to keep the building heated and physical building. There's all sorts of costs involved in that. So what we started to do was take a look at how do we encourage more people to use the cheapest option for us to deliver that meets a certain criteria of satisfaction. And, you start saying, hey, do you realize that you could get this service online without having to come into the office and do it? Now, some people liked going into the office. Some people actually made a business of going into the office and physically searching other people's records for them. And they would do it for lawyers' offices or for real estate agents. But those are just different ways that we can deliver the service in different ways depending on the needs of the consumer of the service. But as Colleen said, now it's getting much cleverer because it's looking at the demographic information, it's looking at other transactions you've been doing, and it's making judgments based on that just to give you what you're looking for before you even have to say, actually, this is the channel I want to use. It knows it before you get there, right?
As we're talking about these enterprise services, these digital services, I mean, it strikes me how critical these are to enterprises and organizations, right? Like these are really, if I can call it, like these are business decisions, business considerations. Today we're talking about it through the lens of IT, but I can't help but feel that like IT plays, like this is technology enabled services, right? Not what are traditionally technology services. Who owns these? And like, are we worried at all about like IT being in an order taker role, IT not even being invited to the dance? Like, how is this shaking out? And what do IT leaders need to do to make sure that the business is best set up for success?
So because so much of the service is going to be enabled through technology, it would be dangerous not to include IT or the technology providers at the beginning of that conversation to design that. It has to be grounded in looking at how the services can be enabled through technology, through the data, and all of those key factors. So if the technology leader is not at the table, that's a huge issue. That said, it's actually really interesting because during the COVID times, pandemic times, we saw a rise in the number of like chief digital officers. And all of a sudden, their huge point of their mandate was to transition everything to digital services, right? We even saw new roles called like the chief digital service officer became a really popular role at that time, or chief digital officer. And they really had to own a lot of that end-to-end design. Now what we're seeing is the reemergence of more physical services again, and we're seeing a new role pop up, and that's the chief experience officer. Right? And that chief experience officer has to partner across the whole organization, but one of their core stakeholders and partners is that chief digital officer, right? So it has to be a marriage between those two functions. It has to be a marriage between the organization and the enterprise as a whole and the technology organization. If it's not, it will not succeed. I feel very comfortable saying, holding on the word not succeed, because it's fundamentally never going to work if both parties are not at the table and committed jointly to the activities.
But it also comes to that definition of services again, and that external view. What is a chief experience officer, but someone who's actually looking at the value and experience of the services you provide?
Right.
Something we're supposed to be doing from net zero. The fact that we didn't do it has given rise to new roles to fill gaps because of all types of issues. Whether it's, I don't want, not really putting IT in that position. The CIO doesn't have the authority and ability to move there. They don't have trust. Whether it's a moving game, but we have a tendency to spin up roles rather than just address what's in the organization as an offset sometimes. It's not the only reason why we generate it. I mean, sometimes there's a new need, but it doesn't mean that another role wasn't intended to do those things. We just don't allow it to do it. One of my favorite quotes from a movie is, you're in a situation, can you construct a rudimentary lathe? Can you build something new off, scratch? I don't need to build a rudimentary lathe. I need to change the responsibilities for the organization and the way we think to do things differently. Every time I spin it up, I've got to reorganize, build new structures, do new things. And I tend to silo it again. And this is a horizontal piece of work. So building a vertical structure to do horizontal work is problematic. Let's fix the horizontal nature of my organization. I know you can have thoughts on that.
I do too.
But in order to do that, so I think this chief digital officer going across is that horizontal function. And you still need vertical functions within an organization because they still have critical services that they have to offer. Now, the fact that they were designing for their own area met their specific needs, right? This is how we also ended up with like 10,000 applications and how we have a huge issue with application portfolio management, right? Is because we think of what we need within our area, the functions and products that we need in our different piece. The service around that is tying all of that together, orchestrating across those lines of business. And it is a truly horizontal view. So for me, you need almost that matrix structure in order to be able to get breadth and depth that you need in order to provide truly exceptional service.
I know, but I've seen it without it. And I'm going to put the context in. If I have the right roles to handle service, that's an inherent piece of how a service owner's job is to do the matrix horizontal work. I manage the value, the experience, which is part of an SLA if you do it right. So we're building roles because we don't do the right things now. The structures are there, we just don't do it. We're supposed to manage experience for services from day one. We spun up an experience management capability because we didn't do it, not because we didn't know to do it. When I go to a restaurant, ambiance, the setting, if I want a romantic meal, I'm not going to the sports bar, I'm going to this one. It has sound, it's quieter, we can talk. It has dimmer lighting, it has certain types of food. There's an ambiance that's part of the service, that experience that I'm paying for. We understand that inherently outside of IT. But all types of services we consume. We get into IT, we suddenly forget that experience matters. And now we have to spin up a role to remind ourselves that experience is part of service. I don't mind us building it, but it's due to the omission of a foundational piece of what we're supposed to do already.
Or you could have that experience within the restaurant, but now that restaurant is actually inside of a hotel. And so in the hotel, I may cultivate this experience within that one restaurant, but I also have an experience with the entire broader organization, right? So now I want to be able to charge everything back to my room, right? But the restaurant manager, they weren't thinking about room service necessarily when they were designing the ambiance of the restaurant. They can design that discreetly from the broader view, right? Now what we're saying is you shouldn't do that. We want to push people to think both ways, and you have to have a shared joint commitment for that, and possibly a role for it.
And I'll do
Tony,
the rest.
save us from ourselves.
I do agree on the fact of integration within a larger macro system, right? Because that's entirely what it is, which is the service is different for the hotel than the fact that it has these benefits and these things on site. But I'll also tell you that, that 2 Michelin star restaurant's not doing room service. They're not part of that mechanism for your hotel. Now, if I, as a hotel, decide to offer it, it's going to be from whatever kitchen or structure I have. I'm not going to do it from the restaurants that are independently owned. But what I'm saying is, at each service layer, understanding experience is part of doing it. And in way too many cases, and I talk about SLAs, SLA is supposed to understand the quality boundaries of a service, which includes your experience. How many people still think an SLA is the performance metrics? They don't even have an agreement on what this should provide, what it shouldn't have, what the experience should be, what's acceptable, what's not, what the obligations are, things that define what a service is. People think that's been distilled down to what's my uptime. That's not what service level agreements are. It's an agreement between parties on the experience, the quality, and all those dynamics at play. So if we don't even do that foundationally well, you see the rise of the digital experience officer. You see digital experience management coming up as an actual practice when it's a piece of an existing practice that wasn't done. We've had to formulate things to fix things we don't do. So I have no problem with them spinning up, but they're a response to us not doing what we should do in the first place.
So you think they're late, not wrong?
They're not wrong. They're a response to us not doing the right things at all. And now we spun up a new practice to do things that should be done here because we didn't do it here.
How important is changing your operating model to get this done? Is that a precursor to this? Can you get it done with your current structures? And there's at least 2 different components here that have come up. One of them is that, orchestrator role. And then the other one is the matrix part of it is having these service focused delivery teams, if you can call it that. How do we see that playing out, and how much change is required for this to actually be successful?
So I think there's a couple really critical risk factors when you're going into this. One, it's who the IT leader reports into, right? If you have a very traditional operating model and you're reporting into someone like the COO or the CFO, you're going to have a much bigger hill to climb than if you're reporting directly into the COO or whoever is the head of your organization, right? And then there is the introduction of new roles, but those roles have to have authority and autonomy, right? So the introduction of whether that's the chief digital officer whether that's the service orchestration roles. We're also seeing a rise of offices around service experience coming through as part of that chief digital office. And so these are really critical roles that are going to work across the silos, right? They need to be people who have authority in the organization, though, to make decisions that are respected amongst the business leaders of the different lines of business as well. And so that's the biggest transition I see. They also have to orchestrate not only up within the organization, but across the technology organization as well, right?
Is that could do or must do to be successful?
I would say if you want to really be able to drive forward, I think it's a must do.
I would agree.
I think there's a bit of scale to this too, though, because if you are lower down in the organization, you have a different sphere of influence, but you should be trying to do this in your sphere of
Yes, that's
influence, right? It doesn't mean, oh, I'm 2 levels down in the organization, so I'm not even going to try.
Mm-hmm.
You should try, right? You should try and build those partnerships with the business and start to think about some of those things and start to move forward on some of those things, because that's what will get you up to that level that you need
That's
to do.
a really good point. We've been targeting all the innovator functions of this, of like the true digital services. There are still internal services you can provide to your organizations to start to demonstrate some of those capabilities, get out of more of a reactive mode into more of that business partner function. So I think that's a really good
Earn
point.
the right. to
Exactly.
play.
I'm still going to bring you back to the core point. If I'm measured on performance and stability and not innovation,
Yeah.
innovation does not get valued by me.
Right.
I'm going to get graded on these things I do. It's not even incentive. I have limited time and I'm not going to spend it on things I'm not going to get value for. I'm going to spend that time on things I'm going to get beaten up for if I don't do them. So if you don't change how I measure performance, what I value, it's very hard for people to do that at the ground level because that's not what they're measured on. It's not what they're paid on. And I'm not giving up my bonus if I got one to go make that micro improvement. No, people are going to do what they're measured on first. And we have to really focus on the fact that that's a true reality. Measurement drives action, and action in this space requires some of those things to change. And then as you go to, yes, we build the right structures for it. We also look at the delivery models of the services we execute and build those out in a way that allows them to integrate. That's going to help with the orientation of services. It doesn't help in the individual definition of a service, but it will help in the cost and execution of a service down the line. So to bring us back up to the level of, we have to have the understanding to define a service in a realistic way. Absolutely. All these mechanisms are the things that allow you to do that successfully and execute them successfully once defined. And make sure it meets the value proposition you define, the quality expectations, and the boundary of those services.
I think that big bang reorg, redesign of your operating model is difficult too, because sometimes you don't know. Right? So you just need to take what you have and start working within that confine and then go, okay, so now we actually understand what structure we need.
True. But the change sends a message, right? It sends a message of the changing role of IT that you are taking this seriously. And I think you need that level of commitment in order to make that happen.
And we'll jump back to the culture. It sends a message if it's the first time you do it. It doesn't send a message if it's the 10th time,
20 times.
and
Well,
the previous 9 failed.
It does send a message.
It absolutely sends a message. But in terms of driving an action,
Right.
if I failed at this 9 times and come at it the 10th time that looks the same and quacks the same,
Yeah.
I'm going to assume it's going to have the same result and I'm not going to put effort in. A lot of change, including operating model change, fails because I'm just going to do what I
Here
do.
we
It's
go
going to come
again.
back to this again.
But your operating model shouldn't be changing that regularly,
No.
right? Your structure should be changing all the time, right? Pretty regularly, because it should be dynamic to what you're doing. If you are truly changing your operating model every 8 hours, that's a bigger problem in the mix, right?
You never land that thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry.
There is another cool trend that you were talking about that what you said really triggered me on, and you were talking about the metrics and these roles. One really interesting trend that I have seen for these chief digital service officers and chief experience officers is how they're measured for success.
Mhm.
So you see, actually, rather than traditional technology metrics, they often have their own P&L, or they're accountable for the growth of the organization connected to that. So it sends a very different message in terms of how they're measured, what their success looks like. And that's often tied back in public-private organizations to how they're compensated. So they're actually getting different bonus or commission structures based on that true digital service and how it's enabling growth, how it's driving metrics. And that is a scary change to a lot of traditional technologists who are like, I don't want to do that. But for others, it's actually really exciting because it represents a true change from technologists being back office to true growth role within the organization.
Yes.
And I think that's really neat.
Yeah.
I mean, scares probably a lot of people, but
Well, it's a big shift, and it is scary because the traditional role is what most people are used to. But that shift to, okay, I'm going to look at it differently. I'm going to look at that external view. I'm going to be compensated for focusing on the value of my digital services and the experience that people have with it, which is really what we're aiming for when we get people to look at that as they define the service. That is a major shift and a positive shift. And it's one that's actually huge in the industry right now. We're seeing the rise of that entire domain of, I won't call it the science of it, but the practice of it is actually growing pretty strongly right now.
Right. Guys, I wanted to say a big thank you for your insights today. This has been a really informative discussion.
Well, thank you.
So let's dig into the methodology a little bit and talk about, the steps you recommend to get us there. What's involved if we're actually going to define these services? What do we have to do?
For this particular set, we started with the focus on something we've talked about before, starting from the outside in and getting that perspective. So how well do we understand the customers, that perspective and that value proposition? Because that's going to be the frame of it. Because I think the more we understand what they need, how they need it, who we're serving, the better, the more we're able to actually start to look at the services and define what we need to build or understand what we have. The second thing is looking at the cultural readiness within this set. It's always hard to distill culture down to a very particular set of things. It's a very dynamic thing, but we have to understand, are there constraints or cultural elements that will tell us how ready you are to move down that path or how far down that path you already are? It's a very different exercise, building a path from 70% there than if this is day one. So the cultural readiness is to help us understand where you're starting from. At that point, we can get into the point of actually understanding service vision and mission. So what is the service intended to do? What's its mission or purpose or mandate if you're government? In a lot of cases, I don't have a financial purpose, I have a mandate to serve. So once I understand what that is, I can get into the point of let's define the services that we have or identify services that we need to build. So just defining what you do is powerful. How many organizations struggle because they can't really identify, here's what my services are, here's what my products are, here's what we do, here's what's included and here's what's not. Like just understanding the boundaries of a service tells you a lot. So once we have that ability, we have a sort of a roadmap that guides how we're going to do this work in the future. So I think that's really kind of the core of what we're trying to build here, and helping people do that on a more consistent basis. Let's embed that into the organization effectively.
Right. So as we tackle that, Valence, do we typically start with a single service? Do we start with kind of the scaffolding to, spin up multiple services?
Often it's starting with the organizational perspective. Well, what are we built for?
Yeah.
Who are we serving? Let's just understand and get some of those dynamics at play. So
got it.
How
So
well
the bigger questions of the audience versus the audience of one specific.
Exactly. Because to understand what we need to provide, we have to understand who we're providing it to and why.
Yeah.
And value, as I said, is subjective. So different people or different consumers are going to have different value props. We want to understand that because it feeds the design of services further down the line.
For organizations or for people who go through this methodology, what do they walk away with?
First, they walk away with information on sort of the customers that they have, that sort of view of that. They're also going to walk away with a bit of a plan to move forward. So one, it helps them define what they have in play, but the other thing is it helps build them towards defining those services properly, getting the details, understanding what to capture about those services that are provided. It also is going to help them identify gaps sometimes. We have these particular needs. We have gaps between the services we define and provide and the needs. It might fit into the portfolio view of the services that we have. Do we have gaps in what we provide or where we provide it? So it's going to give people an opportunity to understand a lot more about what they provide and its fit in the organization, and a good plan to continue that moving forward.
Right. It builds that foundation that then has all these different jump off points where you can take it, where you need to go next.
Yeah. One thing the set does is actually help define the difference between some terms that people confuse. a product, a service, a
Sure.
capability, people confuse what those things are all the time. So putting a little bit of a stake in the ground and saying, this is what a service does and encapsulates. Here's where you have a product. And sometimes there's close correlation between how those are looked at.
Yeah.
But the difference between that and the capability, which is I have the ability to do the data work. That's not the service I'm providing, but it's a capability of the organization. It helps people distill that down,
Right.
and really look at services in the proper way.
So, how long does it take to, get this foundation set up? And, how much can be done in one concentrated week of effort?
In one concentrated week of effort with the right personnel, you can actually do a fair bit, because I think the biggest thing in the workshop, as we run it, is getting the mindset right, getting the understanding correct, and then going through the exercise of starting to define some services. It's useful, but it's a byproduct of getting the mindset right,
Right.
and all those elements. So if we can change how you think about it, then going through the exercise just builds the muscles you're going to need.
Yeah.
To do this more effectively. It's going to give you a view of, oh, that's the right output to get.
Yeah.
That you can leverage in your organization as well. You're not always going to get through the whole catalog of everything. It's a lot to do.
Yeah.
But if I have the mechanisms, the ability, the mindset, and even build a bit of a strategic approach to how am I going to convey this to other parts of my organization, that all makes a lot of the next steps easier.
Right. Right. Valence, this has been super insightful today. I really appreciate your insights.
Oh, thanks again for inviting me, and it was a pleasure.
Absolutely. And if you're interested in learning more about how to define your digital and enterprise IT services, check out the full blueprint at infotech.com.